Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar on tips for hosting great virtual internships. Before I actually get started, if folks wouldn't mind giving me a hand raise or a yes in the chat if you can hear me okay and see the slides. I always like to make sure, yes, good, I'm not talking into the void. But welcome, everybody. If you do have technical issues or questions, feel free to use that chat feature in Zoom. We'll also be having the Q&A feature open as well. I have both open on my screen, so feel free to communicate with me that way throughout the presentation. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end. Just to introduce myself, my name is Dan Herb. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Internship Success Manager here at the Career and Internship Center. I've been at the UW for just over 7 years as a staff member, and my main job on campus is to help provide students with meaningful outside the classroom learning experiences, just like internships, or in this specific case, virtual internships. As a fun fact, I did my first internship when I was an undergrad at UC Santa Barbara for a grassroots political activist organization. And I've also listed my contact information here on the slide. I do encourage employers or really anybody to reach out with questions or how I can be helpful specifically to the work that you're doing. A lot of the tips we're going to go over in the webinar today are a little bit more generalized for really any employer that's out there. But if you have specific questions that meet your needs, given your specific context, happy to chat through and schedule time to do that. And before we get started with today's content, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the university sits and where I am today at home in Shoreline, Washington, and to note that we acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. So just a moment to acknowledge our space and our place before we get started with the content for today. All right. Here is our agenda. It's pretty straightforward. Essentially, I'm going to go through 5 tips. So the tips, as a little preview, over-communicate, making a plan, setting expectations, creating a community, and ultimately nailing logistics for your internships. We're just going to go through each of those individually as our sort of 5 tips, and then I'll have time to wrap up and Q&A. Again, I encourage you all to interact if you have questions or thoughts as we go through the tips. Definitely let me know. Love to have that interactive audience experience. And since I always get asked this question, I like to put it at the beginning. I will be sending a follow-up email to anybody who registered for today's webinar with a link to the session recording. So we are recording today's session. This slide deck that you see, including all of the notes, and it's actually just the PowerPoint slide deck, I link to a lot of resources or information in the notes of a given slide that we're talking about. So you don't need to furiously take notes. You'll be getting that from me tomorrow. And then the email itself also has information and resources and links to our documents and stuff for employers. So just an F1, I like to say it at the beginning because I always get asked, you'll be getting that email probably tomorrow morning. I usually send it out once I get the recording uploaded to the website. Okay, so I want to start off with a quick poll and get a sense of who is in the room. So let me just launch this, but the question is, have you hosted a virtual intern before? Just to get a sense of who's in the room. So we have yes, no, but I'm planning to this summer, or no, but maybe one day, and I was really just curious about virtual internships and how to do this stuff well. So I'll leave you all a minute just to answer that quick poll question, and it helps to let me know who's in the room. All right, we have a quick group. You're already all done. That's great. So I'm going to end the poll. I'll share out the results and I'll read it for the recording. So most folks have, yes, they have hosted a virtual intern before, which is great. Hopefully these tips will help you to improve the existing programs. One person is planning to this summer, and then a few folks, maybe one day in the future, you'll plan to host a virtual internship. So thank you all for sharing. That's really helpful to know. We have a little bit of everything, but most folks have done this before, which is great. Okay. So with that sort of context and setup in mind, let's get into our first tip of the day, which is over communication. So what do I mean by over communication? This is probably the biggest difference between working in a physical office environment as opposed to working from home or teleworking or remote work environment, is that communicating, how we talk to our bosses, our colleagues, how we solve problems, how we ask questions is just entirely different, right? If I want to schedule a meeting, I can't just walk down the hall and chat with you. I need to, ping you on Teams and then schedule time on your calendar. It feels very formal. It's just a very different world to navigate in terms of communications. So the big question for all employers in any sort of working environment is, how are you going to communicate? What is your system? What platforms are you using, or platform if you want to use one? With whom do you communicate, and how regularly and how often? All these types of questions we actually have to define in a much more explicit way than in the previous sort of in-person working environment. Maybe if we had our weekly meetings with our supervisor, and maybe, oh, if you had a quick question, you can Slack me or whatever else. But we didn't really have to think robustly about, oh, how do I really communicate? Because I'm just sitting at home. If I don't use a thing or do it in the way that works for everybody else, then I'm not able to communicate with my colleagues. Some recommendations for how to do this well. Some of these are going to be pretty straightforward, but you want to have regular check-ins with your interns, really with any employee in a remote environment, because you can't walk down the hall and see how things are going. Whether that's, I think at the most, we've seen weekly check-ins, but I've even heard of internships where they have daily or even like a welcome to your shift, and at the end of your shift we're doing a quick check-in. That's probably the most that I've seen, but have those scheduled, make sure they're on the calendar, and that time is protected for the manager. I've seen so often that a supervisor of an intern, they have that weekly check-in, and then, oh, this other project came up, or I have to run to this other thing, can we reschedule, or let's just cancel for this week. And that happens 2 weeks in a row, and you haven't talked to your intern in half the summer, right? So really value these regular check-ins. This is a time for you to have that communication, and figure that out. And then whatever system you set up when it comes to over communication, let's say we're going to have weekly check-ins in Zoom, and if you have quick questions, you can ping me on Slack, and whatever else. Reflect on that, right? We set up a system at the beginning of the summer for an internship program. A couple weeks in, is it working? Do you feel like you're able to get your questions answered in a timely manner? Do you feel like you have enough structure and scaffolding and direction to do the work that you're doing? Or do you need more? Or do you need less? Could also be the option, right? Oh man, I feel like we're checking in every day. I have nothing to say to you. It's kind of weird. I don't know why we need to check in. Maybe if we did it a little less frequently, that would actually be helpful. So having that reflective conversation and trying to figure out what's working, what's the best system for us to create in our individual environment is going to be helpful. That's kind of an ongoing conversation, right? That could change. A good example of this is a new interns coming in during the onboarding period when they're first starting. They probably need a lot of support, right? They're just learning this position. They're just learning about the working world. You're probably going to have more frequent check-ins and communications. Halfway through an internship, maybe towards the end of the internship, they're a lot more independent and kind of have abilities to work on their own and don't need as frequent communication potentially. So that might change over time. So that reflection piece and talking about this is really helpful. Okay, a couple other notes on over communication is just some ideas for how to do it well. So these are the platforms that a UW student would have. So if you recruit a UW student to your internship, they have access to Zoom, Skype, and Google Hangouts through their UW NetID, and many students are familiar with these platforms. We also know students are using lots of other platforms like Slack or Teams or whatever else. So whatever platform you use is great, but just if you're trying to pick one, these are things that UW students will know. In terms of how you communicate, having verbal communication in a remote environment, that's like what we're doing now, and sort of you're listening to me talk verbally, as opposed to having a written email or some sort of documentation that's created. Figuring out what works best for you, for your interns, for the project that happens to be going on. Some folks really like having written agendas and written follow-up. Some folks prefer the more informal verbal communication, or a combination of both. Again, things to think about in figuring it out. And as you can probably tell with all of the maybe it's this, maybe it's that recommendations, the key point here is to be flexible. In an ideal world, as a manager, you could adjust your communication style, your needs, what works best to make things successful in the office or in the work environment for each of your interns or each of your employees, right? Everybody has a different preference or something that works best for them. And ideally, you could tailor it to each individual person. In practical sense, that's not necessarily viable, right? It's a lot of work to have to create different systems for every single individual employee. But you do want to have that conversation, right? If you do have a system you use as your organization, talk about why and how it's helpful, and how that student can plug in as an intern. For many students, this is their first job experience or working experience that they've had. So navigating all these different things of how to communicate effectively with a boss, with a colleague on a group project is going to be a big barrier. And it's the number one thing we got feedback on when we first went remote that first summer that broke down, was sort of how do I communicate? I feel like I'm just sitting at home on my computer and I don't know what to do or who to talk to. And communication was largely the solution to that problem. So tip number one, over communicate, and just recognizing that it takes work to do this, right? This is harder to do in a remote environment than it is in an in-person environment when you can just walk down the hall, pull someone in for a quick 10-minute check-in. You can't, you can do that, but you have to schedule it. You have to figure out the link. You have to make sure it's on the calendar. You have to protect that time. It's a little less spontaneous than the in-person environment. All right. That's tip number one. Again, any questions, thoughts, feel free in the chat or in the Q&A. I have both open on my screen. Happy to answer as we go. That's my first of 5 tips for today. So with that, we'll go into tip number 2, which is to make a plan for your virtual internship experience. Hopefully this was an obvious thing coming in, but just some recommendations on what to include in your plan. If you weren't planning to make a plan, I do recommend doing that and having basically before day 1, so before the start of the internship, you have a plan for how you're going to manage that student, what their goals are, what they're working on, and what that looks like. So thinking through the goals of that internship, right? What are the priorities for your organization? What are you hoping that this intern is going to complete in terms of work product for what they're working on in your organization, and why, right? Why are they doing that? Is it helpful towards X, Y, or Z goal? What's the bigger picture sort of making that connection for the student before they get started? What needs to be completed specifically? What are you looking for as an end result? Students are very sort of result and endpoint driven, right? If you think about their experience as students with a class, they get a syllabus at the beginning of the course that's like, all right, here's how you get an A in the class. So as clear as you can be about what needs to be completed and how they get there, that's a much more familiar space for them to be in than, oh, well, here's the big goal, figure out why. Some students are going to thrive in that, and some students are really going to struggle. So the more explicit you can be in scaffolding, oftentimes that's a good place to start, and then allowing for more autonomy later on is a good way to go about doing it. And thinking, what needs doing, what are sort of the projects that they're working on. I alluded to this just before, but thinking about the roadmap. So how are students getting to that endpoint? What does that look like? What's the sort of structure or scaffolding along the way? Again, for students where this is their first working experience, they're not going to know all the ways that to complete a project or the big picture stuff because this is their first time doing it. So they might need a little bit more structure and handholding to get to a good endpoint. And thinking about, how are they actually going to complete the tasks? Are there specific software programs? How are they demonstrating progress to you as a manager? How long do you expect it to take? Setting those deadlines is really key, right? If you just say, all right, here's your tasks, good luck. And they're like, well, is it supposed to be done today by the end of the week? Again, making it really clear sort of what is the plan, what is the structure, and in a remote environment, again, because you don't have that ability to do the quick check-in or see how things are going, or they can walk down the hall and ask you, you want to set them up as much for success as possible. When you then send them off for the rest of their 6-hour day to work at home, you want to make sure they're able to make that progress and demonstrate that progress to you. So that's the idea of like what a plan can look like. And again, this is going to really be specific to your organization, the projects that your interns are working on, and what you need completed as an organization. So this is more the general idea. But why should we do this, right? Why am I talking about making a plan? I mean, ideally, with any internship, you have some sort of what you want them to work on before they show up. But why be this explicit? And there's a couple of reasons. One is that by doing this in advance and writing out, okay, what do we want the intern to work on? What are their big picture goals? How are they going to get there? It's confirming why you have an internship in the first place, right? Like, why did you decide to recruit a student for the org? What are they actually working on, and why it's important? What we see with Generation Z, the current typically aged college student population, is that they want to have meaningful duties in their internship experiences. They want to know their work is contributing to some sort of larger goal. And it could be not necessarily a societal good, but just a larger goal in general. How does it fit into the organization? So having this plan is really going to make that conversation much easier and clearer for the intern. I mentioned this a couple times, but having this plan and detailing all this out provides a lot of structure and clarity. That's again one of the biggest things we heard from students first couple of years of virtual internships was they weren't sure what they were supposed to be doing or where they could go for advice. They were sort of sitting at home and felt stuck. So the more you can scaffold and structure and make it clear what you want and how you want them to get there, the easier it is for them to be successful in a telework environment. And by having this plan and really clear goals, you as the manager can track progress, right? Okay, great. I'm expecting X, Y, or Z work product at the end of the week or by the end of the day. I'm going to log on to our, file sharing system and take a look and see that my intern has done this thing. And if they haven't, I can give them feedback and we can talk about that, right? It creates the roadmap for how the intern can, quote unquote, get an A in the internship, right? What does that look like for them to be successful? So that's why we recommend doing this from the employer side. It's just going to alleviate a lot of headaches on both sides if everyone's clear on the plan for the internship. And if you're not sure where to get started in terms of answering some of the questions that I'm putting forth to you, we do have a couple of resources available. So on the left here, and I've linked to both of these in the notes of the slide, and you'll be getting the slide deck from me in an email tomorrow morning. But the left side is thinking about how do I develop a remote internship. It's essentially the handout version of all the things I'm talking about today. We're talking the work plan there being in the middle. And then on the right side, actually a 2-page handout. This is the first The first page of a screenshot is what are different types of project ideas that an intern can work on. And again, it's more general because you're going to know your work and your organization and the needs best. But if you're not sure, well, what can an intern actually do, or what's appropriate for a college student intern, the sample intern projects handout can be a good way to get things started in terms of brainstorming ideas for your company or organization. So that's tip number 2, making a plan, being really clear about what you want an intern to be doing, what their goals are, and how they can successfully complete those goals and demonstrate project to you as a manager or to whoever their manager might be. Okay. And again, any questions, comments, feel free to use that chat Q&A throughout, but seeing none, we'll go ahead into our third tip here, which is setting really clear expectations. So I also preface that this is a best practice for any manager-employee relationship, internships or otherwise, as being really clear on expectations. But in a remote context for virtual internships, this is definitely a space we saw communication breakdowns between employer and students when it came to what each expected of each other in terms of a successful internship. So the idea here is you want to be clear about what you want from interns. So we talked in the previous section about what needs to be accomplished and how it should be accomplished, when it needs to be done, that sort of deadline pieces, but also things around communication norms. The idea here is that everybody's on the same page about how to get an A in the internship, right? Again, just going back to that academic analogy that students are so familiar with. And it can be more than just about the work product, right? Maybe it's about what platforms you're using for communication, or how quickly emails should be responded to, or are cameras on or off in our Zoom meetings, right? All these kinds of norms and expectations that we have as an organization or a company in terms of how we show up to work, how we do our work. If you're not explicitly communicating those to a student or to an intern, they might not be aware, and they're just going to do whatever they want to do, which might not align with sort of the cultural norms or expectations that you have as an office or as a team. So especially in a virtual environment where I can't see what everyone else is doing, I don't have the sort of social cues that I typically would get around, I don't know, how folks dress or how folks show up to meetings, or how I ask questions, or all these different things that I can watch my colleagues do in an in-person environment. Remotely, it's just me, right? So the more explicit, the more you can write them down and share this information, the better. And also acknowledging that they could change over time, right? We're going to set expectations now. Let's revisit them in a few weeks and see how things are going. Maybe we'll make adjustments given how things are going. I'll also note for the expectation setting side, I talked mostly about your expectations for your interns and being clear, but expectations go both ways, right? Students have expectations of you as their employer. Maybe it's things like getting paid for their work. That's an obvious one, but also making sure that managers have time to meet with them and support them and train them. Interns, in terms of why they do an internship, it's to build skills and experience for the next thing, right? Internships are learning experiences for these students. And so they expect their employers to provide that learning opportunity for them. And that's going to look very different depending on your work, but recognizing that it's not just about you wanting interns to get things done for you. Interns want you to get things done for them. And also you have expectations of yourselves, right? How do you feel like you're supposed to be showing up in the work environment and what you should be doing? And acknowledging that if you're not meeting your own expectations, that could come out in different ways. So the big thing here is I recommend in your one-on-ones, in chats that managers have with employers, talking about these things, right? We don't necessarily say all of the expectations out loud especially in US work culture. A lot of things are just like, oh, you'll pick that up as we go. So, talking about it early, being as explicit as possible. If you can write most of this down, so therefore it can be referred back to, that is ideal. But recognizing it's an ongoing conversation, and if expectations aren't being met, it's something you can refer back to when giving critical feedback and how to improve performance if that needs to happen with your interns. So some other ideas for how to do this really well. Again, a couple handouts that we have available, and the links are in the notes of this slide. The first is setting learning goals. This is sort of a way to think about expectations of what are we hoping that you learn in this experience. It's more in the reverse, where it's a student expectation for you. But by having a goal of you're going to learn this software program, or I want you to have exposure to, multiple different units within our company, whatever that looks like. Developing those at the beginning of the internship and referring back to them and kind of explaining how the work the intern is doing relates to the goals that you all set at the beginning of the internship. It's a great way to create that structure and roadmap that we talked about in the make a plan section, by having these goals that you set up at the beginning of the internship experience. So the handout on the left here is for a general idea for how to set those goals. We use the SMART goal acronym as our recommendation. And then on the right side is a performance evaluation template. So this is sort of thinking about the end of the internship and reflecting back on expectations and the work that was completed. And we have a structure which we use called our level up competencies. It's 9 different sort of skill areas that employers say they look for in recent graduates. And you can reflect on each of those. One of them is manage self here, to give feedback on performance and think about growth areas for students, because again, at the end of the day, they're hoping to learn and benefit from the internship experience as they go on in their academic and professional careers. So that is tip number 3, setting expectations, being really clear about what you want from your interns, what they should want from you, and also a little bit about what you want of yourself in terms of how you show up to work and be successful in the internship relationship. All right, we have 2 more tips. Again, feel free to pop any comments or questions as we go. And we should have plenty of time at the end. Usually this webinar takes closer to 30, 45 minutes. I know we scheduled the full hour, but we probably won't take the full hour. All right, so number 4 is creating community. This is probably the thing I get the #1 questions about in terms of talking with employers about remote internship experiences. So a little bit of research to share. This is from the Mary Scott Resource Group. They're an amazing research think tank that almost explicitly looks at internship experiences of students and employers in the US. So they're a treasure trove of information. This is something, a report from they did back in 2019. This is pre-remote internship. So it'd be interesting to see if this has been updated. But essentially, they were looking at what are the factors that lead a student to be satisfied with their internship. What do students care about in an internship? And the reason that satisfaction matters is there's a ton of other research that shows if you have satisfied interns, it leads to a whole bunch of other great outcomes like higher performance reviews, more likely to accept an offer from a company after they're finished with the internship, lots of good outcomes for you all. So what are the factors that lead to satisfaction? The first thing on here is an opportunity to get to know the other interns that are working with them. So if you have a multiple intern cohort model, it's not just one student. #1 thing on this list in terms of what they asked about was getting to know their colleagues and their peers in the internship program. Satisfied with geographical location. Again, this is not a relevant thing in a virtual environment, but that was interesting to share. That sort of place mattered in terms of previously in-person internships if a student had to travel. Learning about other parts of the company, activities for interns to get involved, social events, and then again, housing arrangements being not a relevant thing for virtual internships, but thinking more about these community and connections. And the point here is that all of these things have to do with the sense of community and the people that a student is interacting with. And you can see that they have a pretty significant positive correlation to internship satisfaction in terms of the survey responses. So I just want to provide that as some contents about why community is as important as it is, because it really is one of the #1 things that students talk about in terms of why an internship was a good experience is the people that they got to meet and work with. So it's hard to do this in a virtual environment. I don't know for folks who've, when we went virtual all in 2020, it was definitely difficult for me in terms of just feeling like I was connected to my colleagues in our office and feeling like I had a sense of community because I was home all day and it was very isolating. So recognizing that reality and that this is more difficult to do in a virtual environment, here are some ideas for how to combat this. And again, this is a very short list of ideas. There's lots of other things I'd encourage when I go through this, if folks have ideas in the chat that they want to share that they've done in their companies and organizations, that would be great to hear because there's a lot of ways people are doing this now. But some ideas for how to create community in that virtual environment. If you have larger meetings that you're doing as an organization, invite your interns to the meeting. Even if they don't have a piece of the agenda that they're going to present on or do, being a fly on the wall, getting that exposure and getting to meet and hear from other people is really valuable and makes them feel like they're part of the team. Very simple thing to do that will help them feel engaged. If you can facilitate coffee chats, informational interviews, these have lots of different names, or even just introductory meetings, that's really valuable. I think something that interns often get to do in an in-person environment as, oh, Greg down the hall wants to grab coffee with you so you can chat about your job and your project. Why don't you go do that, take 20 minutes and, come back. It's easier to facilitate that in person. In a virtual environment, that's a meeting on my calendar, right, with a Zoom link or whatever, however you meet, right? So it's a little bit more, it feels more formal, even though the content and the interaction is still in that informal, we're just chatting about, who you are, your background, what you're interested in, how you got to your job, that kind of stuff. So if you, as their manager, the intern manager, can facilitate that, right, and either directly schedule it with the person or do some of the outreach for or on behalf of the intern, it can be really intimidating for a student who's just maybe this is their first experience in a professional environment, reaching out to somebody like, hey, I'd love to talk with you about your work. That can feel really intimidating, and they might not feel like they can or should do that. So either encouraging them to do so, or even better, doing it for them or helping them along, at least for the first few times that you set these up, can be a great way for them to build connections across the organization. We saw on the previous slide, there were a couple things about social events and social activities. You can host these in a virtual environment. There's tons of fun, tools like I think Kazoo, or I forget the names of them, but there's like quiz games and all kinds of ways you can do virtual events nowadays that are out there. And you can invite your interns, you can invite the staff and the interns, depending on your size and what makes sense for your organization. Lots of different options there. If you have sort of digital communication platforms and ways for folks to connect directly, things like Slack channels, Facebook groups, lots of different ways that folks connect, that's really great. And especially if you can make something that's private to the intern, if you have a cohort of interns, to just the interns, right? The conversations that happen in a space where the manager's not around are very different than the conversations that happen where it's all inclusive of all the employees at a particular organization. So providing that sort of privacy and space for them to make connections peer-to-peer is really, really helpful. And ultimately, at the end of the day, a great way to solve this community problem is to ask the interns themselves or your staff, right? What are the ways that they would like to connect with their other colleagues and other interns or folks at the organization? They might have, this is a very short list of ideas. They might have other ideas that they'd recommend in terms of getting involved and connecting with other folks at the organization. So this is a great thing to bring up during one-on-one, especially asking, do you feel like you're connected? Would it be helpful to meet with other folks? What can I be doing to make you feel like you have more of a sense of community at the internship experience? All these questions are great. And even if there's not a great solution immediately available, students will appreciate that you're thinking about this and wanting to make that a better experience for them. So building community is really important for not just interns, really for all of your staff, but in the internship in particular, because of the short-term nature that they're new to the organization, you want to make them feel as included as possible. Definitely being really intentional about that is key. All right, we have one last tip, and then we'll get into our wrap up, which is nailing the logistics of the internship. So essentially what this means is being on top of the things that an intern needs to be successful in a remote environment. And because there's never a good experience if it feels like your employer's not ready for you or not prepared for you to do the work. So questions to ask yourself in a virtual internship environment: do interns have access to everything they need to do the work? Do they have a laptop? Do they have access to high quality internet? Do they need software programs? Do they need to do specific trainings? Do they need a login permission to our security protocol? Whatever the thing is for your particular project, for your internship, for your organization, think through those logistics before the intern starts on day one, so that you have a plan during onboarding to get them set up for success. It is never fun when your boss is like, oh, how do I get you into that protocol? Well, I'll submit the request to HR. It might take a little bit. In the meantime, I guess you can work on something else, right? It just doesn't feel like you're prepared for me. It doesn't feel like you know what's going on. It doesn't make me feel valued in the organization. So you want to figure these things out in advance. Another logistic item that comes up all the time with virtual internships is time zones. We're based here on the West Coast in Pacific time. If you are on the East Coast in New York, DC, etc., that's a 3-hour time difference. If you're doing meetings at 9 a.m., that's 6 a.m. for us, which is very early. You can definitely do that, right? Some students are willing to do that, but recognizing time zones, especially if you're working with international students who will go home to their home country for the summer, you could have really differences in the sort of the time zones, and navigating that can be really challenging. So for companies that have done the remote thing for a while, this is a big thing that comes up. But I think for organizations that are like, yeah, we'll do some virtual internships, see how that goes, this can often be a logistics item that gets missed, as recognizing you might be recruiting students from all over the country, if not in an international space. So figuring that out If you do want them to have specific overlap hours, if they do have a radically different time zone, be really upfront about that. When is it going to be? What works best for the student? Is early morning or is evening or whatever else? So talking that through is helpful. Another piece about the logistics when it comes to on the student side of the equation and basically where are they showing up from is considering their context. I mentioned this already. Thank you for logistics before day one. But the second point here is that everybody's office environment or living room or dorm room or wherever they're working from is going to be different, right? So a good example where this has come up is we as an organization want cameras on for any meeting that's happening in our organization because we feel like it creates, it shows that you're listening. It's a better sense of community. Great. If I'm home for the summer at my parents' house and I'm in their living room and that's where I'm able to work, cameras on might be you seeing my mom in the background or, my little sister running around, playing or whatever else, right? I might not have the privacy and what we expect sort of a professional environment to be in terms of a safe, calm, quiet environment to work 100% of the time, right? Maybe some of the time I have that, sometimes I don't. So recognizing that everybody's situation is going to be different. So when it comes to the logistics in terms of, does a student have access to high quality internet or a laptop? Maybe they're a low-income student and they can't afford to buy their own, so they use a computer resource at the school at UW during the year. In the summer they don't, so they actually need that, right? So thinking through those kinds of logistics and being able to offer solutions instead of sort of placing or shifting, not blame per se, but like making the student figure it out for themselves is going to be difficult, right? If they could have figured it out, probably they would have done it already. So trying to be an advocate and a useful resource in those moments as the employer it is going to make for a better experience for both parties involved. So being flexible, acknowledging context is going to matter, what makes sense is going to matter, being curious if these kinds of things come up, right? Asking questions instead of accusing or making more statements is going to help navigate some of these potential issues when it comes to the logistics of doing a virtual internship. And if you have more questions about that space in particular, in terms of navigating sticky conversations or really setting up interns for success overall, a couple of other resources that we have. One is just this handout on the left about creating a high impact experience. So this is really trying to level up your internship into not just, great, we both got work done and things are good, but how can I really make this a high quality experience for everybody involved? And then I run a separate webinar called How to Be an Awesome Intern Manager. I ran it last quarter. You can view a recording on the website and I'll link to that in the follow-up email. I think I'll run it again probably next year at this point, since we're getting towards the end of the academic year. But we have a couple other resources if you're thinking about, okay, this is good basics. How do I then level up and improve the internship experience to make it that much better for my interns? Okay. Those are my 5 tips for how to host great virtual internships. I'm just going to quickly wrap up and then we can do any comments or Q&A. Again, these are the 5 tips we went over communication, making a plan in advance, setting your expectations both for you and your intern, creating a sense of community, and ultimately nailing the logistics. I'm going to launch a really quick poll just to get your feedback on this webinar. So you should see that poll there popping up. But basically, just let me know if any of those statements resonate with how you feel about the content today. In terms of wrapping up, this is just a screenshot of our Creating an Internship channel on our website. This is a really great resource for employers, and we also have a student-facing one as well. So I'll link to that in the follow-up email that you all get. We also have some other resources that I listed in my email too. If you have any questions or want to talk through your specific context, definitely reach out. Happy to schedule time to talk with employers. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a couple of my colleagues at the UW. So if you are recruiting students in the engineering or business space, I encourage you to reach out to the career centers at engineering or in the Foster School of Business. Fantastic ways to connect with students in those particular colleges if that's your area that you're looking to recruit in. And then just as a reminder, I will be sending the slide deck, a recording of today's presentation, and some more information in that follow-up email tomorrow morning to anybody who registered for the session. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. We're going to jump into Q&A. If you want to hop off, you're definitely welcome to do that. Otherwise, I'd love to hear what questions and thoughts folks have. And I'll go to our Q&A slide, which has a QR code to our Instagram as well, if you want to follow us and see what's going on here at the UW.